Good day, everyone, and welcome to Gartner Live. I'm Jeffrey Wheatman, VP Advisor and the chair of Gartner's Security and Risk Management Conference. And today I'm joined by Katell Thielemann, VP Analyst, who focuses on risk and security of cyber-physical systems. Hey, Katell, how are you?
Hey, nice to be here with you today.
It is great to see you. It's been a while. So we're gonna focus on a fairly new topic, I think, for a lot of our security and risk leaders, but it's become increasingly visible over the last year or so. And that topic is about cyber physical systems. I talk to CISOs all the time, and this comes up. And to be quite honest with you, I think a lot of them struggle really with what cyber physical actually is. You know, we know cyber is the buzzword, cyber this, cyber that. I had a call yesterday about cyber resilience and cyber risk and all these different things. And I think cyber physical is a fairly new topic. I think it's really important because it leads to a tremendous amount of new threats and very, very serious ones. So, why don't you tell me a little bit about what are cyber physical systems? So let's kind of start from the beginning. What are cyber physical systems, and why do people need to care?
Sure. Well, let me start with the official Gartner definition, and then I'll give you some examples, and I think that will bring the point home. Our definition is that cyber physical systems are engineered systems that orchestrate the sensing, the computation, the control, as well as the networking and the analytics to interact with the physical world. And the physical world could be humans. And so what is important here is that every word in that definition matters, because what we're talking about are systems that are designed to interact with the physical world. So think about sensing, actuation, computation, control. It could be control of a process, control of something that happens, whether it's sensing humidity, whether it's on a manufacturing line and there's a robot doing something. And what is really important here is that when secure, those cyber physical systems enable safety, real-time, reliable, and adaptable performance in the real world. So they truly bridge that cyber digital plane and the physical plane. So think about medical devices, smart buildings, smart cities, operational technology that have over time been connected to enterprise IT system. Basically things that fall under the umbrella of what people might call IoT, IIoT, Industry 4.0, you name it. Those are all great concepts. And it's, most companies like to tout their IoT programs and what have you. But from a security and risk standpoint, it's very difficult to defend and protect concepts like IoT. But the moment you start thinking about these systems as cyber physical systems, your aperture sort of, the light bulb goes on. Oh, I've got to think about security and risk along that bidirectional cyber physical plane.
Okay, so that's awesome. It's very complicated, and I think it's probably very confusing for a lot of people. So I talk to banks a lot, and banks say, "Well, we don't have IoT, we don't have OT." How do we get people to understand that, in fact, while it may not be a core part of their infrastructure, there are inbound and outbound elements that they don't necessarily have a lot of involvement with, but it still has an impact on their risk posture?
Sure. And banks have systems that interact with the physical world all over the place. I mean, if you're in retail banking, you have ATMs. Those are cyber physical systems. If you're in an environment where you're supporting finance and banking and credit card transactions with retail clients, you have point of sale systems. And we've certainly seen how, from a cybersecurity standpoint, those are vulnerable, right? Think about the Target hack, for instance. There's whether CISOs think about it or not, their organizations are surrounded, and increasingly so, by systems that interact with the real world. If you think about the mega macro trends out there, and you're looking at population trends, for instance, in advanced economies, 25% of the population will be 65 or over by 2040. That's up from 15% in 2010. What does it mean? It means increased need for digital health, increased need for robotics, for automation. The workforce is going to shift. More and more of humans' interactions with the world in every single industry, including industries like finance, who think they're, sort of out of the loop, will be cyber physical.
So it sounds like this is often as much about a mental switch, a mind sort of change, the way we look at things, as much as it is about the actual devices themselves, right? CISOs, chief risk officers, CIOs, et cetera, need to think bigger, I think, in a lot of cases than we're hearing from them now. Is that a fair comment?
It is a fair comment because, and this is actually one of the hangups that most CISOs might have, is that their own title is about information security. This is more than information. This is about more than data. This is about also actual process security, actuation, sensors. When you think about cyber physical systems, what is really truly important with regard to that mental model shift that you were talking about is that you need to architect for safety. You need to architect for reliability. You need to architect for privacy, for instance, and not just privacy of, yet another, 10 million social security numbers were released. But actually, for instance, if you're renting cars, how do you architect for privacy of humans plugging in their iPhones day in, day out into those cars? Those cars become cyber physical systems the moment, all of these devices are plugged in and information is being shared. How do you look at security in the real world, where, for instance, tampering, spoofing, malicious USBs can be plugged in open ports all over the place? Those things happen in the physical world, right? So it becomes more of an asset-centric view of security and risk, and understanding how those assets and systems are being used in the real world, including the physical world, as opposed to focusing primarily on tracking data and how it flows and securing the information in the cyber world.
So, it's interesting you talk about plugging into USBs. We just got back from a trip up to New York. And, we obviously have not been spending a lot of time in airports, but it always amazes me that people will just take their phones and they'll just plug them into any USB port sitting all over the airport and on the airplanes themselves and in hotel rooms and all these things. And I think people just assume that those are trusted. And I don't think people realize that not only is USB about power, but it's about data transfer back and forth. And it's interesting you bring up the safety because, wow, I would say 6 years ago, we did a scenario where we took the traditional CIA confidentiality, integrity, and availability and added safety, resilience, and privacy. And it sounds like that's now becoming a much more real thing. So let's talk a little bit about so what are the implications of this cyber, right? And you talked about the role of chief information security officer, and we've actually seen, and this was talked about in Peter Firstbook's report on trends in security, about the fact that we're seeing a transition from a CISO to a CSO role. And the new CSO role, chief security officer, owns a lot of this expanded ecosystem. So what are some of the implications? And maybe if you can share some of your experiences about people that have made that transition and some of the struggles, right? Because a lot of traditional CISOs come from very technical backgrounds, and all of a sudden they have to think about something very, very different that they've never really had to consider before.
Yes, absolutely. And let's not downplay, the challenges that CISOs have to face. Let's not downplay the cybersecurity, information security centric side of things. I mean, it's certainly a tremendous challenge, but the world we now live in, because of this cyber physical connectivity, changes the role itself. So, for instance, if you think about it, if you're a bad guy, where are you going to hit? You're going to hit where the path of least resistance is. And the path of least resistance may not be your enterprise IT systems. It could actually be your supply chain. It could actually be, looking at real world impact where physical security is owned by facilities. Supply chain security may or may not even be owned by somebody in operations or in procurement. Health and safety is owned by another group altogether. And, you're going to find the fastest way to inflict pain. And that fastest way might be away from information-centric security practices, if that's all an organization focuses on. So what we've started to see is the emergence of a chief security officer that is higher level than information security centric and brings about all of the security disciplines sort of under an umbrella. So physical security, for instance, video cameras and badges and what have you are now all connected back to enterprise systems. How do you take a organizational wide view of it where you're actually linking, for instance, your HR systems, and as somebody, retires or moves on, immediately access gets denied, and immediately, there's a way to figure out whether that person is coming back in the environment or not. Supply chain security. How do you get assurances that the firmware, that the software, that the hardware that you're bringing into your organization has some assurances? Health and safety. How do you bring the level up around that safety culture into the security discipline? Even product security. I'm having more and more discussions with organizations that are starting to realize, we've been focusing a lot on first to market in the past. And first to market, unfortunately, has often meant security was in the back seat because we always thought, well, let's rush our product out there, and we can always issue a patch later on. More and more organizations are starting to realize this is no longer okay. And we start seeing, for instance, things like the latest executive order in the United States that is specifically calling out those behaviors or saying, no, it's not okay. We're going to now mandate more requirements, for instance, for software, supply chain, security. People are starting to realize as hard and how thorny a problem information security, enterprise security is with regard to what the CISO is dealing with. We're now facing a much bigger world, and the biggest risk of them all, honestly, is that most organizations I talk to don't even have a clue as to how big that problem is.
Yeah, it's interesting because this really ties back to a lot of the research that we've been doing around risk, value, and cost modeling and outcome-based security and risk management, which is really about connecting all of these things back up into business objectives. You made a great point about the first to market. We saw that when IoT was really, very nascent. And to your point, I'm increasingly talking with executives above the CISO saying, so should we be integrating product security? And I think that's particularly true in automotive, where we have all these connected cars. Mm-hmm. It's true in medical devices, where we see all these things connected. So, it's definitely something that people need to be aware of. And I think you're spot on with the worst danger people face is the one that they don't actually know exists. And I think sometimes there's a disconnect in communication. So it's great that you're engaging with people at that level. So So now that we've talked about how bad and dangerous and everybody's, quaking in their boots, what are some of the implications? What should people really be doing other than just talking about the problem, right? We could admire the problem all we want,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, we need to act. So what are some of the things you're guiding our clients about on how to get this conversation elevated to the board and to the non-IT, executives?
Yeah. Well, here's the beauty of cyber physical systems is because they live in the physical world, they're tangible. You can actually touch them. You can actually figure out, what they are. I think one of the big issues we have with cybersecurity in general is that it's become too abstract. It's become too intangible. There is a great amount of fatigue out there. I think the population at large is sort of like, another 10 million credit cards have been, put on a dark web. So what? Or, XYZ report from the government says, billions of IP intellectual property has been exfiltrated. It's too remote. It's not me. And then events like the Colonial Pipeline ransomware event happens. And then the next week, the JPS meatpacking event happens. And oh, by the way, 4 weeks before, somebody managed to get into the Oldsmar, Florida, which is a city in Florida, water utility and fiddle with some of the water system gauges. And all of a sudden, it's no longer abstract. If you cannot go down the road and get gas for days on end, that is no longer abstract. That is a direct impact on your real physical life, your lifestyle.
Well, I could tell you,
And
Katell, I live in Southern Florida, and my region
yeah,
is fed by Colonial, and the gas prices went up immediately, and they still haven't really come back down. So
well, there
I'm
you
feeling the
go.
hurt right there.
Yeah, so that hurt is felt in the physical world, and if you extend that to security leaders, security and risk leaders in organizations, the best way they can get their board or their C-suite to pay attention is to show them. Number one, they can start with showing them what they do not know. There are a number and growing every quarter number of vendors coming to market with solutions that are specifically targeted at detecting, inventorying, and mapping all of the connections of unmanaged, rogue, or OT systems that are now connected to the environment. So I am yet to talk to any one of our clients who has not deployed some of these solutions and came out with, sort of deer in the headlight. Wow, we had no idea all of these things connected. So that's one thing. Raise visibility by showing this is what our environment actually looks like. Number two is the security and risk leaders should know, based on all of these evaluations, what the high value assets in their environment are, right? If you're independent, and it's obviously very dependent upon what vertical industry you might be in, or what stage of market growth you might be in. But once you actually know what is connected to what and what is within your environment you didn't even know you had, then you can start saying, okay, those are the top 5 high value assets. Because they live in the real world and because they support either operational or mission critical processes, again, going back to real life process control, for instance, then we can start having discussions with those senior leaders. What would happen if these systems went down? What is the impact to the bottom line? This is no longer abstract. This is no longer people yawning because social security numbers have been released yet again. This is putting a dollar value on operations going down. And going back to the Colonial Pipeline, Colonial Pipeline was not ransomware to their operational environment as best we know, and we don't know all the details, but what has been released was the attack was on an enterprise IT system. And either as an abundance of caution, because they knew the IT systems were connected to the OT systems, or as an abundance of fear because they didn't know to what extent those systems were connected, they decided it was the prudent thing to take all of these systems down. And so I think that's a great example of that cyber physical connectivity where not knowing can be as damaging as knowing that you have deficiencies, because at the end of the day, the output is the same. Operations
Right.
went
And,
down.
it's interesting you mentioned, because so in a previous role at Gartner, I used to work with a lot of our energy and utility clients. And back then, 6, 7 years ago, the OT security was handled by a different team. And every time IT security went and said, hey, can we help? They said, no, we got it. Well, it turns out they were practicing a lot of security by obscurity, which no longer works when everything is converged. And I think to your point about, connecting it back to the bottom line, that level of abstraction is a challenge for a lot of our executives. So those are some great examples, and I think they're also, those are U.S. centric, but I think we've also seen a bunch that are not in the U.S. Right? This is definitely not a U.S. or North American problem. It's global.
It's global. Great example. 2 years ago, Norsk Hydro, which in my mind still remains sort of the gold standard with regard to outreach and transparency and sharing of information with local authorities and with their client base and everybody else. They got hit by ransomware and had plans, activated them. But that was a global problem. People may not know this, but there have been a lot of skirmishes within the last 15 to 18 months between Israel and Iran. We're talking about water utilities in Israel being targeted and retaliation in Iran with some explosions at ports, for instance. Very, very real world examples. And then just here recently, I think this is an example of an attack that everybody should maybe take a step back and think about, not just the immediate impacts, but the second and third order level impacts is what still happening today in South Africa. South African ports are all part of a sort of government-owned logistics and transportation network. And it so happens that the ports were targeted for ransomware. They were all put on halt. And South African ports not only support the South African economy, they also support the export of minerals, for instance, from neighboring countries that are landlocked. And it so happened that this ransomware attack happened 2 weeks after some events relating to the imprisonment of the prior president that had already halted transportation for 2 weeks. And it so happened that this event happened at the same time that South Africa was in the process of exporting the citrus crop, which is a major, major part of farmers' economy there. And you can now start seeing why critical infrastructure, which is under constant attack in this country and everywhere around the world, can have such impacts on so many different levels, right? Now you have an economy that was already trying to recover from COVID. You've got an economy that was already under stress because of unrest. And all of a sudden you have this event that has a very real cyber physical impact, not only on the ports themselves, the port employees themselves, but the South African economy at large.
So it sounds like there are these crazy cascading failures, right? So it's not a traditional attack where something goes down and then you can't process billing. It's obviously much bigger than that. So let's actually talk a little bit about what are the different threats that we see on cyber physical as compared to traditional technology security threats?
Sure. So when you start opening that aperture, right, when you start thinking about, okay, what threats might also happen in the physical world, not just the cybersecurity threats that might have, trickling impacts, you start thinking about, do I have any security controls regarding tampering, sabotage, service disruption or denial of service in the real world? Do all of my devices out there have any sort of protection for attacks on power supply? Any sort of protection on spoofing of your GPS or jamming? We had some really fascinating stories last year where ships, maritime assets, maritime cyber-physical systems were shown creating circles off of Shanghai port, where in fact they were hundreds of miles away, right? The GPS on the ships had been spoofed. Do you have protections against jamming? Do you have protections against eavesdropping? And eavesdropping, for instance, by drones. Drones themselves are cyber-physical systems, and drones can be very, very useful, for instance, to do maintenance on your electric cables or to take pictures where it might be unsafe for humans to go. But drones can also be used as listening devices. They can carry some payloads that can be dangerous. They can be used as a hacking platform. They can be used to disrupt operations, right? Those are all different vectors that are now emerging. And if your only focus is really information security, data security at the enterprise, you're likely missing all of these different threat vectors that are starting to emerge. And it's really important to get ahead of it, because guess what? When things like 5G, for instance, start rolling out, we're going to see more and more of these connected assets, more and more of these cyber physical systems, not less.
So I think I'm just going to throw all my devices in the garbage. I think that's probably a good. We're too connected as it is, I think. So one quick observation, and then one final sort of broad question, right? So we know that ransomware is big business now, right? Organized crime is involved. I think the statistic I saw was that last year, $400 million, and that number may not be right. That's the number that's jumping in my mind, of ransom was paid. And I think in the first half of this year, it's almost at that level, and we're only halfway through the year. And based on your comment before, right, we know nation states are involved, and they have a tremendous amount of money to throw at these things. And it's very, very difficult to understand where these attacks ultimately come from. So it puts us in a position where even if we want to attack back, it's very, very difficult to do that. And private enterprise going after a nation state would be a challenge. So let's kind of circle back, right? Because this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So I'm going to ask you to give me some advice that I can help our clients with. When the CSO, the CISO, the chief risk officer, whoever is going in front of their board and going in front of their C-level executives, how do we communicate that this is not a problem that can be ignored, no matter what industry you're in, no matter how big you are, no matter where you are located? How do we help them understand, right? Because we can't get them to understand. We have to bring them to the water so they can drink. How do we get them to understand that this is just going to become more and more of a challenge, and it cannot be ignored?
I think, again, the best way to do is show them. Show them, for instance, do a show dance search. Show them all of the stuff that is connected in their sprawling enterprise they have no clue about.
So I'm sorry. So you mentioned what is Showdown for those that don't know?
So it's a online tool, in essence, where you can show what vulnerable assets, what vulnerable IPs are connecting out there. And it's a tool, unfortunately, used by attackers to figure out, oops, there's vulnerable assets that are connecting out there, and let's use that as an entry point. So use that tool to basically turn the tables on the bad guys and show your own leadership what might be out there. But above and beyond that, deploy some of these asset discovery tools that I was mentioning. So you can show them the landscape of what your organization's asset landscape looks like. What is connecting to what? You can also, for instance, show them in many cases, particularly in asset-centric companies, you've got OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, that sell, multi-million-dollar connected systems, and contractually they're allowed to remote in. I talk to a lot of organizations that don't even have a policy around that. They don't even know who's connecting in and how and whether that connection is secure. Show them by going on a little field trip. go and see your operations. Show them, see those video cameras. Where do you think they connect in? See those newly deployed robots. What kind of assurances do we have that the vendor has some sort of security in their own supply chain? Show them, insider threats. If you're going to visit, for instance, again, in a plant or manufacturing environment, show them the workstations. Show them how many of these workstations still run on Windows 7. I think this is the unique opportunity for security and risk leaders, is to realize that physical world dimension of the cyber physical systems and use that to show the threats, the vulnerabilities, but more importantly, the impact to business, the impact to the bottom line, if they're not thinking bigger and broader than information security.
All right, that is a great close, Katell. Focus on the impact to the business. Love it. Katell, it was great to see you. It's been such a long time since we've been together, and I miss you and all of our colleagues. Thank you for joining us and educating me as well as all of our listeners. For those of you that would like to learn more about these topics and dozens of others, please join us this year at our Gartner Security and Risk Management Summit. You can find more information about attending in the description of this post. My name is Jeffrey Wheatman. I am so happy that you joined us today, and thank you very much for watching Gartner Live. Have a great day. Stay safe and healthy, everyone.